Hi, in this next video we're going to look at how to create a server-side trace. A server-side trace, like its name suggests, is a trace file or a trace running directly on the server instead of being run remotely on a separate instance and then having the data pushed over the network to the client system. The advantages of a server-side trace is that it consumes very less resources compared to that of a client-side profiler trace. Generally, as far as DBAs are concerned, you want to run a profiler trace over an extended period of time. So it doesn't really make much sense to have that data sent over to you over the network, especially if you're not looking for something in particular and you're capturing a wide variety of information. The other advantage of running a server-side trace is that it's actually executed using store procedures. Therefore, what you get is you have control over when a server-side trace starts and when it stops. And this could be useful when you're just sampling the resource usage or the kind of queries that are running on the server during random intervals of the day, especially if you schedule it using SQL Server Agent, etc. So these are some of the real advantages that most DBAs prefer to keep in mind when they're working with the server-side trace. In fact, on most production systems, there would be a policy or at least some kind of recommendation from the existing DBAs to not run profiler traces, at least during peak hours when customers are logged into the database. So keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and see how to create a server-side trace and what different store procedures are involved in that process. Now, the server-side trace is a little complicated to understand for the novice because of the kind of events and columns that we capture, but essentially the server-side trace basically captures or works with just 4 store procedures. The first one being sp underscore trace underscore create, which is the store procedure that you would use to create a trace file. The second store procedure that would be required is sp underscore trace underscore set event, and as the name suggests, this particular store procedure is responsible for creating events and capturing the different underlying data that you would be required to capture as part of setting up this profiler trace. The next one that you may optionally use is sp underscore trace set filter. You might have seen this when I created a duration filter for the template in the previous video, where I wanted to capture store procedures or queries that took more than 1 second to execute. This is often useful when you're trying to look for very specific scenarios and you want to filter the data so that you don't cause too much of a resource constraint on the production server. The last one that you'd be interested in is sp underscore trace underscore set status. This particular store procedure will be used mainly to go ahead and start, stop, or pause a trace. So you would generally want to go ahead, create the trace, add the events, maybe set a few filters, and last but not least is to stop the trace after a certain amount of time. Now, considering that these store procedures and the kind of events that are available are pretty massive, and you don't really have an idea about what needs to be done in terms of which store procedure parameters you need to pass for different events, the neat feature that's available with Profiler by default is that you can create a trace and then export the trace definition. By doing this, you're basically going ahead and capturing the trace definition of the store procedure or the parameters that need to be passed to the store procedure so you can execute it directly on the server itself. Let me go ahead and show you how that works exactly. So we go ahead, create a new trace as before, and this time, instead of actually going ahead and using one of the default templates, I'm just going to use blank, and say for example I'm just looking for database growth and shrink. So I've got 2 things here. I'm capturing quite a lot of information, but that's good. I don't really want anything more than this. So I've got one event, or basically one event category, and then 2 events under it, and then a couple of columns, or not couple but quite a few columns that I'm capturing here. In addition to this, let's say that I want to go ahead and capture objects that have been created or deleted. So I've got basically 2 event categories that I'm monitoring at this moment. And the next thing that I want to do is that I want to filter this for just the database that I'm interested in. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose ABCD for this moment, right? And I'm going to run it. Now, as soon as it starts running, I want to go ahead and pause it, and after that click Save As, export script trace definition. Click this one, and you can see that it exports the data into a SQL file. So I'm just going to call it trace definition.sql, and I'm again saving it on my desktop. This is saved now, so let's go ahead and have a look at what exactly this particular trace file is doing. I'll go ahead and open up this file by clicking File. This is within Management Studio, by the way, so it's fairly straightforward. And as soon as I open it up, you'll see that these procedures that I mentioned earlier show up here. So you got sp_trace create, and then you got sp_set trace event. I've got the filter for the database, and then last but not least, I've got this trace status, which is basically to run this trace. So a couple of things that you need to keep in mind here is that when you're running sp_trace create, the trace ID is the output. It will give you an idea about what the trace is. 0 is basically just giving you an idea about what kind of input parameter this particular trace file is using. So 0 is basically just the input. If you set 2, it means that files roll over. If you set 4, it means it's shut down if there's an error. And if you do 6, it does both. So that's pretty much it. The next thing you want to do is you want to configure a file path for the trace output. So I'm just going to go ahead and do c:/sample trace.trc. Max file size, as you can see, is defaulted to 5, so this is again in MB. I'm going to leave it as it is. Null over here is basically the date time, and if you go ahead and add comma 10 here, it means how many files will be rolled over. So it'll create 10 files, again depending on what you specify here. It'll create 10 files, and after that it'll just reuse or basically delete older files to make sure that on an average there are only 10 files running on the server at any given point of time. So you might notice that as far as the trace events are concerned, I've got 4 trace events that I was capturing. So you got 92, 94, which is the log file growth, the database growth and shrink, and then you got 46 and 47, which is for objects created and destroyed. The next column that you're seeing here, or the next set of values that you see here, is the column level information, and last but not least you have the on flag, which is to indicate that this trace event is now on. So at this moment the trace is ready to be started, and what I need to do is just go back into the screen, and I've changed the path of the trace file to a folder within the C drive, so that I can go ahead and execute the stow procedure to create the trace. The reason is because Windows operating system will not allow me to create files directly in the root of the C drive. So let me just go ahead and run this, and as you can see, I've got a trace file or trace ID of 2, and what this means is that there's some trace running on the server at the moment. As you can see here, the trace ID is here, and this is the location of the trace file. So at this moment, let me just go ahead and create an object in abcd, and then let's query the trace file to see if it's actually captured the information. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a table abcd. It's got identity, it's an ID, and it's got int. Let's just leave it at that for the moment. Let me just go ahead and change the context to abcd of this database, as well as let me clean up the previous table that I just created in MSDB. So at this point the trace is running, and it's supposed to have captured the information. So let's go ahead and stop the trace now, and I'll do that by running trace ID 2 and then changing the status to 0. So with this is executed successfully, if I now go to MSDB and then do select star from sys.traces, you can see that the status is 0. If I want to go ahead and delete this trace file after this, it'll just simply be a matter of me going ahead and putting in 2 over here. But before I do that, I want to go ahead and query the trace file to see exactly the data that's been stored inside this trace. If I open up the trace file, you can see that it's got the information about the object that I just created. So you can see that object created is there, and you'll see that the name of the object and the type of object, which is basically a user table, is captured in the trace file itself.